Iron Ridge was a breathtaking community nestled along the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada foothills, a place where nature met wealth, and the sun seemed to linger just a little longer over the pine trees and winding mountain roads. The homes here weren't just houses. They were statements: glass-fronted mansions, cedar lodges, and modern estates built to dominate the ridgeline view. But no house was grander, no personality more imposing than that of Margaret Kensington, the self-proclaimed Queen of Iron Ridge. Margaret wasn't just any resident. She was the president of the Iron Ridge Homeowners Association and had been for 7 consecutive years. Her rule was absolute, her word unquestioned, and her vision for the community ironclad. Under her leadership, lawns were manicured to military precision, exterior paint colors were restricted to a narrow palette of mountain neutrals, and every mailbox looked identical, right down to the brushed bronze handles. To the casual observer, Iron Ridge was perfection. But beneath the surface, it was a place where resentment brewed like storm clouds behind polite smiles. Margaret's home sat at the very top of the ridge, a sprawling 10,000-square-foot estate with panoramic views of the valley below. Locals referred to it as the Citadel, not only for its fortress-like appearance but for how completely it symbolized her dominance over the HOA. She often threw lavish cocktail parties where she'd invite select residents, mostly those she could control, and from her marble patio, she'd boast about her next big project. "Vision," she would say, swirling a glass of Chardonnay. "Iron Ridge deserves vision." And her next vision was more ambitious than anything she had attempted before. Margaret had grown tired of the limitations of the mountain terrain. The steep slopes made it difficult to expand her property, and the HOA's charter prevented large-scale commercial projects. But Margaret saw potential where others saw obstacles. The idea came to her after a trip to Aspen, a luxurious private resort community built into the Rockies. She wanted to bring that same grandeur to Iron Ridge, only bigger, bolder, and more exclusive. Her plan? To build a luxury mountaintop resort, complete with chalets, spas, and a private golf course, right above the Iron Ridge community, on a section of land that technically sat outside the HOA's jurisdiction, but within the town's mountain protection zone. The only problem was that the land was geologically unstable. It was known for loose granite, thin soil, and a history of small rock slides. The county had denied construction permits there for decades, but Margaret was not one to be told no. She pulled strings, called in favors, and even used HOA funds under the guise of community improvement research. Through a mixture of manipulation and intimidation, she managed to secure exploration rights to the area. Soon, trucks began arriving, and contractors set up temporary offices at the base of the ridge. Residents grew uneasy. They didn't know the full extent of what she was doing, but they could tell something big was coming. And then came the drilling. For weeks, the sound of blasting echoed through the hills. Tremors shook the foundations of nearby homes. Driveways cracked, and some residents complained about new fissures appearing in their retaining walls. Margaret dismissed it all as minor disturbances, temporary inconveniences in the pursuit of progress. She sent out glossy newsletters with renderings of the Iron Ridge Mountain Resort, describing it as a world-class retreat that would elevate property values and prestige. But the truth was far more reckless. The mountain wasn't being shaped, it was being mutilated. Explosives were used far too aggressively, dislodging deep layers of granite and destabilizing the slope. Engineers warned her about it. Environmental consultants resigned. Even the county inspector stopped returning her calls. But Margaret pushed forward, convinced she was building a legacy. She had invested millions, some of her own money, much of it borrowed, and she wasn't about to let caution stand in the way of glory. By midsummer, a wide plateau had been carved into the mountain's side, a massive scar in what was once a lush, forested slope. The air was filled with the scent of crushed stone and diesel. The locals started calling it Kensington's Crater. Still, Margaret stood proudly at the edge of it one evening, wearing a silk scarf and oversized sunglasses, as if surveying her empire. She truly believed she was unstoppable. But what she didn't see, or refused to see, was the slow, invisible shift of the earth beneath her feet. The cracks forming deep in the rock layers were growing wider. Water from the summer rains was beginning to seep into the fractures. The mountain was losing its cohesion, inch by inch. Down below, in the valley community, some residents began to whisper of danger. A retired geologist, Mr. Danforth, sent repeated letters to the HOA board warning that the blasting had destabilized the ridge and that the mountain could give way with one strong storm. His letters were ignored, and then publicly mocked by Margaret at the next HOA meeting. She called him a paranoid relic and assured everyone that our mountain is as strong as our community. But nature doesn't listen to arrogance. Late that summer, as the first autumn storms began to roll in, something began to change in Iron Ridge. Strange creaks and groans echoed from the mountainside at night. Driveways continued to crack. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and sulfur. A few residents noticed that the slope behind Margaret's mansion seemed steeper than before. Margaret brushed it off. The resort's foundation work was almost complete, and she was preparing for her grand announcement, a groundbreaking ceremony with champagne and local press. She ordered fresh landscaping around her mansion, new marble steps for the entryway, and a custom bronze plaque that read Kensington Peak Resort. Vision, luxury, legacy. She truly believed this was the crowning achievement of her reign. But far beneath her mansion, deep within the fractured rock, something ancient had awakened. A slow, creeping instability that would not be stopped by money, power, or will. The mountain had been wounded, and it was only a matter of time before it struck back. The clouds thickened. The first heavy rains began to fall, and Iron Ridge, unaware of what was coming, went to sleep that night beneath a mountain ready to move. The rains came earlier than usual that year, heavy, relentless, and colder than the mountain had felt in decades. Sheets of water ran down the newly carved slopes, turning the raw dirt into slick rivers of mud that pooled in the valleys below. The once pristine roads of Iron Ridge were streaked with brown runoff, and culverts overflowed with debris and gravel. At first, the residents assumed it was just a seasonal inconvenience. After all, Iron Ridge had always been a place where nature tested human persistence. But this time, nature was testing something far more fragile: the arrogance of a woman who thought she could command a mountain. Up on the ridge, the ground beneath Margaret Kensington's mansion had begun to change. The soil, stripped of trees and vegetation during her blasting campaign, could no longer hold itself together. Beneath the surface, thousands of microscopic fractures were growing, connecting, forming a vast network of instability. Every raindrop that seeped into the cracks pushed the mountain one step closer to collapse. Margaret, ever confident, continued with her plans. She told her small circle of loyal board members that everything was under control. Construction on the resort's access road was nearly complete, and she had already pre-sold exclusive memberships to a handful of wealthy investors who had never set foot on the property. Her vision was grand: a glass-encased spa overlooking the valley, private ski chalets carved into the mountainside, and a luxury golf course that she promised would redefine mountain living. But as the rain continued, the cracks began to show, both literally and figuratively. The first signs came in small ways. A section of her driveway buckled, creating a shallow dip that her landscaper blamed on settling soil. A retaining wall along the south edge of her property started to lean outward by an inch or two. The stone pathway leading to her infinity pool developed a jagged fracture that widened with each passing storm. Then came the reports from the residents below. Several homeowners noticed that their backyards were shifting, fences tilting, patios splitting apart, and once straight trees beginning to lean at odd angles. The HOA's maintenance hotline was flooded with complaints, and though the board members nervously debated what to do, Margaret shut the topic down with characteristic force. Temporary erosion, she called it, a minor side effect of progress. But in the valley, whispers turned to fear. Old-timers who had lived in the foothills for decades remembered the stories, how that section of the ridge had once been considered unstable, how it had been off-limits for any form of heavy development. They remembered the minor rock slides of the 1970s, when a small quarry operation had tried something similar, and failed. Now, with Margaret's Kensington Peak Resort project tearing into the very bones of the mountain, those memories resurfaced. Meanwhile, at the construction site, the workers were growing uneasy. Their boots sank into the muddy plateau where the resort's foundation was supposed to go. Every morning they found fresh cracks in the concrete pours from the day before. Excavators sat idle for hours as engineers debated whether it was safe to continue. Some days, small rocks tumbled down the slope on their own, harmless but unnerving. One afternoon, after a particularly violent downpour, a section of the access road gave way entirely. A chunk of asphalt, along with several drainage pipes, collapsed into a gully below. The project's site manager begged for time to reevaluate the geotechnical stability. Margaret refused. She claimed it was sabotage, that certain residents were spreading rumors to make her look bad. In her mind, she wasn't in trouble. She was under attack. Her paranoia grew with each new setback. When the power went out one night after a transformer flooded, she accused the utility company of negligence. When the local paper ran an editorial questioning the environmental safety of her project, she called it defamation. She began holding private meetings at her mansion late into the night, promising her inner circle that she would weather the storm, both literally and politically. But the storm was only getting started. One morning, residents awoke to find that the mountain itself had shifted. A long, jagged scar of disturbed soil ran down the slope behind the Kensington property, a dark streak cutting through the otherwise green terrain. It was as if the earth had opened its mouth in warning. Some said they heard low rumbling sounds in the night, like thunder trapped underground. Others swore they saw dust clouds rising from the ridge, even when the sky was clear. Local authorities began to take notice. A county geologist arrived for a routine inspection and immediately raised red flags. He filed a report noting severe slope destabilization and recommended a full halt to construction. The HOA board received the notice but never forwarded it to the residents. Margaret intercepted it, shredding the copy and calling it bureaucratic nonsense. The following week, the rain intensified. Storm drains overflowed, and muddy water gushed down every incline. The newly carved access road turned into a river. The resort plateau, now little more than a soggy plain of clay and gravel, began to sag under its own weight. The scaffolding twisted, steel rods bent, and a temporary office trailer slipped halfway down a slope before being rescued by a bulldozer. Still, Margaret wouldn't yield. She spent those nights pacing her marble floors, watching the storm through the panoramic windows of her mansion. The wind howled against the glass. Lightning illuminated the torn edges of the mountain, revealing the raw, exposed rock that she had once bragged about shaping. Now it looked like a wound, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of unease. Her empire, built on arrogance and stone, was starting to crack. As the storm raged through the night, the mountain groaned again. The sound was low, deep, and unnatural, like something ancient shifting in its sleep. A few houses down the slope, residents were jolted awake as small tremors shook the ground. A porch light flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a tree fell with a muffled crash. By dawn, the rain finally eased, leaving the entire ridge shrouded in mist. From her bedroom window, Margaret looked out at what she believed was still hers. The mansion, the ridge, the dream of her resort rising above it all. But through the fog she could see it now. A deep, dark fissure running across her backyard, cutting dangerously close to her foundation. The mountain was warning her one last time, and though she didn't know it yet, the next storm, already forming on the horizon, would be the one that buried everything she had ever built. The fissure in Margaret Kensington's backyard was the first undeniable sign that something had gone horribly wrong. It stretched nearly 30 feet across the edge of her manicured lawn, cutting through flower beds, irrigation lines, and the stone path that led to her infinity pool. At its widest point, it was almost a foot deep, a jagged black wound splitting the earth behind her mansion. Contractors arrived the next morning to assess the damage. They found that the soil beneath the mansion's foundation had shifted several inches since the last inspection. The mountain was slowly sliding, not rapidly, not yet, but steadily, like a sleeping giant turning in its bed. The lead engineer warned that unless construction was halted and immediate stabilization work was done, the entire slope could give way. But Margaret refused to believe it. She convinced herself the crack was a surface issue, something that could be fixed with backfill and concrete. She ordered the fissure patched, the lawn re-leveled, and the irrigation replaced. Within a week, the damage was buried, hidden beneath a fresh layer of imported turf and expensive landscaping. From a distance, the property looked untouched again. But beneath the surface, the mountain continued to move. The county's warnings had grown more severe. Reports described increasing instability in the Iron Ridge upper slopes, visible deformation of the road system, and potential for catastrophic failure under prolonged rainfall. Copies of those reports circulated through the lower neighborhood, where residents began to panic. They had invested everything into their homes, and now, because of one woman's obsession, they were living under a collapsing mountain. But the HOA board, still dominated by Margaret and her loyalists, downplayed everything. Newsletters reassured residents that preventative maintenance was underway, and that social media misinformation was exaggerating the risks. A handful of dissenters tried to organize an emergency meeting, but Margaret labeled them troublemakers. She even threatened fines for defamation against the HOA. Behind the scenes, though, her confidence was cracking just like the mountain itself. Contractors were quitting. Insurance companies refused to extend coverage. The resort investors, who had initially seen her as a visionary, were now demanding refunds and legal guarantees. The cost of the stabilization efforts alone had ballooned into the millions. Margaret began quietly pulling money from the HOA reserve fund to cover her losses, convincing herself that she would repay it once the resort opened and made her rich. But time was running out. That autumn, the weather turned volatile. Days of calm sunshine gave way to violent bursts of rain, wind, and thunder that rolled across the ridge with terrifying force. The ground, already saturated from the previous storm, could no longer absorb water. Mud began seeping through cracks in driveways and foundation walls. Residents noticed new sinkholes opening along the mountain road, small at first but widening quickly. Retaining walls collapsed one by one. Gravel paths turned to quicksand. At night, people could hear faint groans and creaks from the hillsides, as if the mountain were breathing under strain. Then came the first small slide. It happened on a gray afternoon in early November. A 10-foot section of the unfinished resort plateau sheared away without warning, sending hundreds of tons of mud and rock crashing into the forest below. It wasn't large enough to reach the homes, but it was enough to send a chill through the community. The construction site was evacuated. Equipment was abandoned mid-slope. The access road was reduced to rubble. Still, Margaret dismissed it. To her, the landslide was just a minor setback, an unfortunate delay that could be managed with proper reinforcement. She convinced herself that as long as her mansion stood firm, everything else could be repaired. Her pride, her empire, was built on that house. She couldn't let herself believe it was in danger, but others saw the truth. The retired geologist, Mr. Danforth, who had warned her months ago, took it upon himself to inspect the ridge again. From his own backyard, he could see the fractures creeping closer, inch by inch. The mountain wasn't just eroding, it was slipping. The entire slope beneath Kensington's mansion was shifting downward as one massive body of earth, like a glacier of mud and stone preparing to let go. He tried one last time to alert the authorities. He filed a formal complaint with the county emergency office, urging immediate evacuation. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and the county couldn't act without verified evidence of imminent failure. Margaret, on the other hand, was faster. She caught wind of his warning and had the HOA issue him a violation for unauthorized surveying on HOA property. It was her final act of control, an attempt to silence the last voice trying to save her. That night, the storm returned. Cold, heavy rain fell without pause, pounding the mountain for 36 straight hours. The wind howled through the pines, tearing branches and flinging them like spears across driveways. The creek that ran through the valley turned into a raging torrent, carrying uprooted trees and shattered pieces of asphalt downstream. Inside her mansion, Margaret watched from behind floor-to-ceiling windows as her dream unraveled. The resort construction site below was now a swamp, lights flickering, scaffolding sinking into the mud. The slope that had once looked majestic and stable was now a writhing landscape of sliding clay and falling rock, and yet even then, she couldn't admit defeat. She believed the worst had passed before. She believed the mountain would hold. But deep beneath her home, in the dark layers of fractured granite, water had found its way into every weakness. Each drop worked like a wedge, prying apart stone and soil, building pressure inch by inch. The mountain's core was no longer solid. It was moving. In the early hours of the morning, the motion sensors on several lower homes triggered alarms. Cameras captured eerie footage. Fences tilting, trees bending, retaining walls buckling as if pulled by unseen hands. The earth was shifting again. The sound was like thunder rumbling underground. Margaret's mansion sat directly atop the fault line, the weakest point of the ridge. The very center of her empire was now the center of the instability. The slope below her infinity pool was beginning to sink, the support columns stretching and cracking, but she didn't evacuate. In her mind, leaving would be an admission that she had been wrong, that her vision, her power and her authority were built on nothing but vanity. She couldn't bear the humiliation of the community seeing her flee. She convinced herself that if she just waited it out, if she stood her ground, the storm would pass. Outside, lightning split the sky. Rain poured harder. The air was filled with the sound of sliding rock. Somewhere down the ridge, a siren wailed. Faint at first, then growing louder. The county's emergency alert finally went out. Evacuate immediately. Slope failure imminent. But by the time the message reached Margaret's phone, the ground beneath her mansion had already begun to move. The first real landslide hadn't yet struck, but the mountain had made its decision. It was no longer a question of if, it was only a matter of when. The storm that night would later be remembered as the worst in Iron Ridge's history. A brutal collision of wind, rain, and thunder that clawed at the mountain with relentless fury. Sheets of water poured down from the heavens, hammering the fractured slope, seeping deep into the open wounds Margaret Kensington had carved into the earth. Every drop of rain added weight. Every gust of wind loosened more stone, and every tremor from the storm's thunder rolled through the ground like a warning drumbeat from something ancient beneath the surface. Down in the valley, emergency alerts blared through cell phones and radios, instructing residents to evacuate immediately. County engineers, having finally reviewed satellite data from earlier that evening, had seen the subtle but unmistakable shift in the terrain. The upper slope was creeping downhill. It wasn't a sudden collapse yet, but it was the beginning of something catastrophic. They knew the ridge could give way at any moment. In the dim glow of streetlights, headlights snaked along the winding mountain road as families fled. The rain blurred everything: faces, houses, the road ahead. Some grabbed what they could and left within minutes, while others hesitated, clinging to the belief that the mountain had held for centuries and would hold again. But at the top of the ridge, inside the Kensington mansion, Margaret did not flee. She stood in her great room, surrounded by walls of glass, staring out into the storm. Lightning flashed across the horizon, revealing the chaos below. The collapsed road, the flooded construction site, the mud churning like liquid earth. To her, it was unthinkable that this was the end. She had built her life around control. Control of people, of property, of image. And the idea that nature itself could defy her was intolerable. Her mansion trembled again, subtly but unmistakably. A faint rumble echoed through the floor, followed by a sharp crack from somewhere behind the walls. One of the chandeliers swayed overhead. Margaret steadied herself on the marble countertop and glanced toward the window overlooking the backyard. What she saw next stole the last breath of denial from her chest. The ground was moving. The slope beneath her infinity pool was collapsing. the earth rolling downward in slow, terrible motion. The water in the pools sloshed violently, spilling over the edges in torrents that disappeared into the widening fissure. The backyard lights flickered as the soil broke apart like shattered glass. The air was thick with the smell of wet clay and ozone. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural roar that grew from somewhere below, resonating through the mountain like the growl of a beast. At 2:17 a.m., the first massive section of the ridge gave way. It began with a shudder, then a thunderous collapse as thousands of tons of soil, rock and debris tore free from the upper slope. The landslide moved faster than anyone could have imagined, accelerating into a roaring cascade of mud and boulders that devoured everything in its path. Trees snapped like twigs. The unfinished resort structures disintegrated in seconds, their steel frames bending and twisting under the force. The construction site, the symbol of Margaret's ambition, vanished beneath a wave of earth. Within moments, the slide reached the base of her mansion. The foundation, already weakened by months of instability, began to crumble. Cracks raced up the walls, splintering across the marble floors and ceiling beams. Windows shattered. Furniture tumbled. The entire building lurched forward as if the earth had taken a sudden, violent breath. Margaret ran. For the first time in years, panic overtook pride. She stumbled through the grand hallway as the floor heaved beneath her feet. Paintings fell from the walls. A massive chandelier crashed to the ground behind her. Every step she took echoed with the groan of bending steel and cracking stone. Outside, the rain blurred the world into chaos. Her once perfect garden was gone, replaced by a surging river of mud that twisted and rolled, dragging trees, boulders, and entire sections of her retaining walls down the slope. The air was filled with the screech of tearing metal and the thunder of collapsing rock. By the time Margaret reached the front entrance, the mansion had tilted several degrees forward. The grand staircase that once symbolized her status was splitting down the middle. She could hear the roar of the landslide approaching. Closer now, louder, unstoppable. The lights flickered, then died completely. For a brief moment, everything went black. Then, with one final deafening roar, the mountain let go. The landslide struck the mansion like a hammer blow. A wall of mud and rock slammed into the lower level, shattering windows and bursting through the foundation. The impact sent the entire structure forward, tilting it down the slope. Inside, floors buckled and ceilings caved in as the building was torn apart piece by piece. The Kensington estate, once the pride of Iron Ridge, was gone within minutes. Down below, in the valley, residents watched in horror from the evacuation site as the glow of the mansion's outdoor lights vanished from the mountaintop. What had once been a symbol of wealth and power was now an avalanche of destruction. The sound of it echoed through the valley, a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to last forever. When the slide finally stopped, the mountain was unrecognizable. The ridge that had once stood tall was now a scar, a vast slope of debris stretching for hundreds of yards. Entire sections of forest were buried. The resort plateau had vanished. The road was gone, and at the heart of the destruction, somewhere beneath the mud and stone, lay the remains of Margaret Kensington's mansion. Dawn came slowly, revealing the aftermath in pale gray light. The storm had passed, leaving behind silence. The kind of silence that only follows catastrophe. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and broken pine. Helicopters circled overhead, surveying the damage, while rescue teams struggled to navigate the unstable terrain. The Iron Ridge community, once immaculate and orderly, was now a disaster zone. Several homes along the lower slope had been damaged or destroyed, though miraculously, most residents had escaped in time. Power lines hung twisted across the roads, and deep cracks ran through the pavement. The HOA offices located midway up the ridge were still standing but flooded. As word spread, news crews arrived from nearby towns. Cameras captured the devastation, broadcasting it across the state. The story of the Iron Ridge, landslide, and the woman who had caused it quickly became national news. Officials later determined that the cause of the collapse was a catastrophic failure of slope stability due to extensive excavation and poor drainage. In simpler terms, Margaret had blown up a mountain, and the mountain had struck back. In the coming days, rescuers combed through the debris, searching for survivors. They found fragments of marble, sections of glass, and twisted metal beams that once formed the mansion's frame. But of Margaret Kensington herself, there was no trace. Some believed she had been swept away with the landslide, buried beneath the ruins of her own creation. Others whispered that she had escaped into the night before it happened, too proud to be found among the destruction she caused. Either way, Iron Ridge would never be the same again. The HOA board dissolved under public scrutiny. The county declared the area a disaster zone, and the once luxurious community became a cautionary tale about greed, arrogance, and the illusion of control. Yet for those who had lived there, who had watched it all unfold, there was one truth that no one could deny. The mountain had taken back what was its own, and as rain began to fall again days later, a cold, steady drizzle washing over the wreckage, the earth seemed to whisper a warning to anyone who might one day try to tame it again. The morning after the landslide, Iron Ridge no longer looked like the affluent mountain retreat it once was. What had been an enclave of manicured lawns, luxury homes, and mountain views now resembled a war zone. The air hung thick with the smell of wet soil, crushed pine, and diesel from the rescue vehicles that had rushed in before dawn. Helicopters hovered overhead, their searchlights sweeping across the broken ridge as crews combed through the wreckage. The Kensington mansion, the crown jewel of Iron Ridge, was gone. In its place was a twisted wasteland of mud, shattered glass, and splintered concrete, buried beneath nearly 20 feet of debris. The once proud slope was now a slanted wasteland, a scar running down the mountain's face, where the land itself seemed to have collapsed in grief. News spread quickly. Within hours, images of the destruction dominated television broadcasts and social media feeds across the country. HOA President's Resort, Dream Turns to Disaster, one headline read. Landslide buries $1 million mansion, said another. Drone footage showed the full scope of the devastation. The vast river of earth that had torn through the hillside, swallowing homes, roads, and the remnants of Margaret Kensington's empire. Reporters swarmed the evacuation center at the base of the ridge, interviewing shaken residents wrapped in blankets and sipping coffee from paper cups. Some wept for their homes, others for their lost sense of safety. And beneath it all, one question echoed again and again. How could this happen? The county's emergency task force began their investigation almost immediately. Geologists analyzed the debris field and confirmed what many already suspected. The cause was human. The extensive blasting, excavation, and drainage alterations from Margaret's Kensington Peak Resort project had destabilized the mountain. The slope had become saturated during the storm, and gravity had done the rest. It was, in the words of one expert, an entirely preventable tragedy. For the residents, that truth was a bitter one. Their HOA president, the woman who had promised to elevate Iron Ridge's prestige, had instead destroyed it. The HOA's funds were gone, drained by Margaret's reckless ambition. The insurance coverage was invalidated because of the unauthorized construction and environmental violations. Every homeowner faced the grim reality that their property values had plummeted overnight. Iron Ridge had become a cautionary tale. In the following days, rescue crews continued to dig through the debris, searching for any sign of survivors. They found fragments of furniture, pieces of luxury cars, and splintered remnants of the resort's steel frame. But no sign of Margaret. Rumors began to swirl. Some claimed she had escaped before the slide, vanishing into the night. Others believed she was buried somewhere under the rubble, entombed by her own arrogance. Without confirmation, she became a ghost story. The county eventually declared the entire upper ridge geologically uninhabitable. The remaining homes near the landslide zone were condemned, and their owners were forced to relocate. What was once the most desirable neighborhood in the Sierra foothills now stood silent, cordoned off by fences and warning signs that read, "Danger, unstable terrain." Meanwhile, investigators began uncovering the depth of Margaret's deception. HOA financial records revealed massive withdrawals in the months leading up to the disaster. She had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from the associations, reserves to fund her resort plans, masking the transactions as community infrastructure improvements. She had falsified invoices, manipulated contractors, and pressured board members into silence. When the news broke, outrage swept through the community. Homeowners who had once admired her were now demanding accountability. They wanted justice. But there was no one left to punish. With Margaret missing, the legal responsibility fell on the HOA itself, and by extension, the residents. Lawsuits flooded in from investors, contractors, and even the county Iron Ridge was financially and physically ruined. Weeks passed, and the media frenzy eventually subsided. Other stories took over the headlines, but for those who lived through the disaster, the silence that followed was almost worse. The evacuation center shut down. Families moved away. The valley grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that follows something that cannot be undone. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow fell over the ridge just 6 weeks after the landslide, blanketing the scarred mountain in white. To a distant observer, it looked peaceful again, beautiful even. But beneath that calm layer of snow lay thousands of tons of displaced earth and shattered dreams. Only a handful of residents stayed behind, people who couldn't afford to leave or refused to abandon what was left. Among them was the retired geologist Mr. Danforth, who had warned Margaret months before. He walked the edge of the collapse zone every morning, watching how the land settled. He said the mountain was still shifting, still unstable, still dangerous. As he walked one morning, he noticed something half buried in the mud. A fragment of polished marble, smooth and white against the brown earth. He recognized it immediately. It was part of the Kensington mansion's grand staircase. Around it were smaller pieces, glass shards, bits of gilded railing, and what looked like the corner of a framed photograph. He stood in silence for a long time, staring at what was left of her empire. In the end, everything she had built, every stone, every inch of luxury, had been reclaimed by the very mountain she tried to control. By spring, the cleanup began. Crews worked to stabilize what remained of the ridge, carving drainage channels and reinforcing slopes to prevent further collapse. The county erected a memorial near the base of the mountain. A simple stone plaque engraved with the names of those who lost their homes, and one additional name marked only as Margaret Kensington. Missing. Visitors came to see it for a while, some out of grief, others out of morbid curiosity. But as months passed, the memory of the landslide began to fade from public consciousness. Nature moved on faster than people did. Wild grasses grew through the cracks in the ruined road, and saplings began to take root in the scarred soil. The mountain was healing. Slowly, silently, in its own time. Iron Ridge, however, was not so lucky. The HOA was dissolved. The properties that survived were left to decay, their once luxurious facades weathering under the changing seasons. Realtors stopped advertising the area. The name Iron Ridge became synonymous with disaster, a warning whispered among developers and homeowners alike. Still, some locals claimed to see lights on the ridge at night, faint flickering glows where the mansion used to stand. They said it was rescue equipment or maybe looters, but others whispered that it was Margaret, that she was still there, haunting the ruins of her home, unable to accept that the mountain had taken back what was never hers to begin with. Whether or not she survived didn't matter anymore. Her legacy had already been written. In the soil, the rock, and the ruin of everything she touched. The mountain had won. And in the quiet that followed, as the wind howled through the hollowed trees, Iron Ridge finally understood the truth. That Margaret Kensington never did. You can buy the land, shape it, even blast it into your vision, but you can never own the mountain. Months turned into a year, and the once exclusive Iron Ridge community became a forgotten relic, a ghost of its former self. The scars of the landslide still marred the mountain, a vast brown wound that no amount of regrowth could hide. The county declared the area permanently unsafe for residential construction, and what was left of the community was slowly abandoned. Homes stood empty, their driveways cracked and overgrown with weeds. Mailboxes leaned at odd angles, filled with rainwater and decay. Nature had reclaimed what Margaret Kensington once ruled. The pine trees that had been stripped away during her resort project began to return, their roots creeping through the fractured soil. Wildflowers bloomed where asphalt once gleamed. The mountain was healing, but Iron Ridge would never be the same. The story of the landslide had become legend, a cautionary tale whispered by realtors, discussed in environmental conferences, and dramatized in documentaries with ominous narration. The words Kensington's folly became synonymous with arrogance and ruin. And yet, for those who had once lived there, the story never really ended. The survivors, scattered across nearby towns, carried with them the trauma of that night. Many refused to speak of it at all. Some still woke up at night, hearing phantom rumbles, convinced the ground was moving again beneath them. Others, unable to rebuild, lost everything: their homes, their savings, their peace. But amid the loss and ruin, rumors began to spread again. Quiet at first, then louder as time passed. Strange sightings near the mountain, unexplained lights, the faint echo of movement from the ridge at night when no one should have been there. Locals said they could see a single light flickering near the upper slope, the same place where Margaret's mansion once stood. Some said it looked like a lantern. Others swore it was the faint glow of electricity, a pale shimmer behind the fog. Hikers who wandered too close spoke of hearing soft, rhythmic sounds, not the wind, not the forest, but the slow, deliberate click of high heels on marble. The county sealed off the area with fences and warning signs, but that didn't stop curiosity seekers. Over the next few years, the story of Iron Ridge turned into a macabre attraction. Ghost hunters, urban explorers, and thrill seekers made their way up the cracked road to see what was left. Most left quickly, unnerved by the silence. A few left terrified. One explorer claimed he had reached the edge of the landslide zone just before dusk. He described the scene as surreal. The mountain still sloping unnaturally, a graveyard of broken stone and overgrown debris. But what caught his eye, he said, was a faint shape halfway up the ridge. Against the dimming light, he swore he saw the silhouette of a grand staircase, or what was left of one, jutting from the mud like the spine of a corpse. And standing at the top of it, just for a moment, was a figure in white, motionless, staring down the valley. Whether the story was true or not didn't matter. It became part of the legend. Years later, the county converted the surrounding valley into a protected conservation area. The ridge itself was fenced off permanently, its terrain too unstable to touch. A simple memorial stood at the base of the mountain, a weathered granite slab engraved with the names of the victims and the date of the disaster. Visitors came rarely now, but sometimes locals would leave flowers or notes, small gestures of remembrance for a place that had once been beautiful and full of promise. Time did what it always does. It dulled the edges of memory. Iron Ridge faded from the headlines, its story buried under newer tragedies and fresher scandals. The HOA was dissolved entirely. The properties that hadn't been destroyed were repossessed or left to rot. In legal documents, the area was now listed as uninhabitable terrain. But the ghost of Margaret Kensington lingered. People who worked near the conservation area, park rangers, utility crews, even delivery drivers, often spoke of odd encounters. Some said they would find footprints in the mud leading toward the ridge, perfectly shaped, as if someone had walked there barefoot in the middle of the night. Others swore they could hear faint music carried on the wind, the sound of violins, the same kind of music Margaret used to play during her lavish HOA parties. One ranger reported hearing her name whispered through his radio static late one evening. Kensington Peak. Kensington Peak. even though the channel was empty. He quit his job the following week. To the rest of the world, Iron Ridge became a ghost town swallowed by the earth. But to those who lived nearby, it became something more, a living reminder of human arrogance and the price of trying to dominate what cannot be controlled. Every few years, heavy rain would trigger small landslides along the ridge. Each one would expose more fragments of what had been buried. A piece of marble here, a section of railing there. Once, a rescue crew uncovered a section of twisted bronze, a plaque that had somehow survived the disaster. After being cleaned and identified, it was revealed to be from Margaret's mansion. The inscription, still faintly legible beneath the corrosion, read, "Kensington Peak Resort, Vision, Luxury, Legacy." It was placed in the local museum alongside photographs of the old community and news clippings of the disaster. Visitors often paused at that plaque, staring at the irony of those words. Vision, luxury, legacy. They had been her mantra and her curse. As the decades passed, the mountain continued to rebuild itself, slowly erasing the evidence of what had happened. Saplings grew into trees, and the scars of the landslide became covered with moss and grass. The mountain endured, patient, eternal, indifferent. But locals still tell the story. When the wind howls across the ridge during storms, they say it sounds like a woman's voice, proud, angry, and afraid all at once. Some call it the wind through the trees. Others say it's Margaret, still trying to defend her mountain, still insisting she had everything under control. Iron Ridge remains fenced off, a forbidden zone where nature has reclaimed power. The HOA that once dictated the color of mailboxes and the length of lawns no longer exists. There are no bylaws, no meetings, no architectural committees, only the quiet, authority of the earth itself, and perhaps that's how it was always meant to be. The story of Margaret Kensington and the Iron Ridge disaster became more than a tale of greed and vanity. It became a lesson written in mud and stone, a reminder that no matter how much wealth or power one wields, the natural world will always have the final say. Today, the mountain stands silent once more, cloaked in mist and memory. The locals avoid it, the forest guards it, and the wind whispers its warnings to anyone foolish enough to listen. They say that on stormy nights, if you drive near the old ridge road and listen carefully, you can still hear the faint echo of falling rock and the distant sound of a woman's footsteps on marble, pacing endlessly in the ruins of her dream. The mountain, they say, never forgets.